earlier on there was this, to me, deeply mystifying appeal to Derrida. I didn't know what he was doing in there at all, because you adverted to him as somehow revealing the bankruptcy either of Heideggerian phenomenology or phenomenology in general, in relation to some set of claims about how phenomenology is caught up in words and ends up with empty etymology. And it sounded as though that was something that Heidegger had done, but was a sort of specifically Derridean Heidegger, from which you sought to rescue a Deleuzean Heidegger who is somehow more compatible with the more productive bits of thinking about time that you very ably expounded in relation to difference and repetition. So, because I want to say, well, I'm not so sure about this bad Derridean Heidegger as opposed to this good Deleuzean Heidegger. I suppose on Nietzschean grounds one could go on quite a long time about that, but I guess I want to wonder why Derrida arrived at all and to object to the manner in which he was described. And so, very briefly, I guess it seems to me that the virtue of Derrida would be that he would exactly permit you to talk about why you need to invoke the actual structure of the actual book, as displaying the manner in which the philosophical idea is both thinkable and not thinkable, in the way in which the thought presents itself on a page, in a book, in a structure, in an impossible book, because it can't close itself. Very briefly, I suppose, and this, it's a long account, it seems to me that there is an account in Derrida, which your gesture suggested there isn't, an account exactly of time, temporalization, temporality, which I suppose, roughly speaking, would go through a notion of textual mechanics, wherein I think what you're drawing attention to in terms of contraction and decontraction actually happens in terms of an acceleration and deceleration of the pace of reading in relation to the text of philosophy, in relation to the presentations of meaning and the presentations of meaning as temporalizations. So I'm sort of cooking up this notion of a textual mechanics, which has some kind of equivalence to a notion of celestial mechanics, such that a notion of time and space comes available, but not that which the celestial mechanics of either Aristotle or Newton or Einstein would deliver. And one, I guess, which would have to make the claim to permit the articulation of the differences between those three forms of celestial mechanics to appear. So textual mechanics is, as it were, the grammatological impossible condition of the possibility of making any difference at all. And it just struck me as very odd, why mention Derrida at all, granted that there's so much, everything Derrida writes is about time. No single element can be really extracted in a way that's all that helpful. So what was he doing there? Is it possible that this kind of textual mechanics is much closer to what Deleuze is doing than either of them is really close to Heidegger?
It's if I didn't want to, I perhaps gave the impression that this was a kind of an easy swipe at kind of Derrida, but I think Derrida's project is admirable, and I think he does something unavoidable. But spatialization and the spatializing or temporalizing function of difference. Okay, if you're going to, what kind of ontological status could it have? And the question is like, what? The problem I was pointing to in, I think that Derrida is again marks this kind of, this apex of sophistication of the philosophy of access, about how do we, it's sort of like, before making claims, substantive metaphysical claims about the structure of reality or the nature of the world or being, the point is to investigate the preconditions, conditions of possibility for thinking about, for making any kind of intelligible claims about the structure of reality. And that's what's problematized in Kant and Husserl and Heidegger and Derrida. And it seems to me that there's something very problematic about ascribing any about ascribing a straightforwardly ontological status. And ontological, I mean in the sense of something that somehow produces or engenders space and time, to différence. Because what actually does it mean? I mean, given that, how do we, on what basis has Heidegger, has Derrida kind of identified the movements, the articulation of différence he's identified it on the basis of a protracted negotiation with, the history of philosophy and the history of Western metaphysics. But the question is, what that's a question about a relationship, the relationship between thinking and what has already been thought about the relationship between thought and the world. And it seems to me that the issue between Heidegger and Deleuze is the question about what does it mean to make ontological claims? What does it mean, in the 20th century for philosophy, after the critical turn, to make any kind of substantive claims about the nature of reality? And the point was that many philosophers thought that this was no longer possible, that this was, if you wanted a description, if you wanted to know about the world, you simply couldn't, it's not philosophical speculation that's going to help you find anything out. Deleuze seems to be making these astonishing claims about the structure, about the intricate mechanisms that structure space and time, that structure reality. That's why the book itself doesn't have, the reason why the book doesn't seem to have an architectonic, or seems to be lacking any methodology, is related to this question about what it is it's trying to do. Is it trying to problematize how it's possible for us to think about the world and to make claims, cognitive claims about reality? No, Deleuze begins by saying things immediately. The first two chapters immediately start making these bold ontological claims about space, time, how space and time are constituted and produced. That's why it's completely disorientating for anyone who's coming from coming from the kind of the post-Kantian European tradition. And I do think the book has a structure, actually. And I think it has an intricate kind of conceptual structure. But that structure is possible because I think ultimately Deleuze is closer to Hegel than he thinks. He thinks that thinking and being, ultimately, there's this point of asymptotic convergence between thinking and being. So you don't need to frame a complex kind of a propedeutic or a methodological apparatus in order to articulate the relationship between them. And I think that's what, ultimately, the reason Derrida is admirable is because he has pointed out, he shows what happens when you push this problematic of access and of the access to its limit. Because the question is always, with what does philosophy begin? If it begins with, it can't simply begin with experience after Kant. It problematizes the conditions of access to experience. But then, even that problematization, which you get in Kant, Husserl, and Heidegger, is itself laden with all sorts of. It turns out to be laden with all sorts of substantive metaphysical assumptions, and these are ostensibly what Derrida is identifying and problematizing. So I don't think Deleuze is better than Derrida. I don't think Deleuze is doing something. We should stop talking about words and get back to things. I think Deleuze shows how the price of trying to talk about the world, in spite of his extraordinary ingenuity, is still a kind of idealism. So I don't think Deleuze is worse than Derrida. I don't think Derrida is worse than Deleuze. I don't think Deleuze is, a kind of doing what, a healthy kind of realist, and Derrida a kind of a poor kind of a decadent kind of sophistical ideals. That's not at all what I'm saying. So I appreciate that point, but I think it's incredibly difficult to characterize difference ontologically, or to say that it has any constituting or productive function vis-a-vis something, the world in itself.
The problem with that is that you're taking somehow difference as though it's a term which could be ontologized, whereas it's the very play of textuality, which is both syncopated and fractured, which all these texts perform. And on that level, it seems to me that it would be true to say that there's not much difference between Deleuze and Derrida, because they both have a demonstration of what they're supposed to be ontologically given, or the real, or whatever, by the very structure of the text that they produce. It's just that you get a greater degree of fracture and syncopation in the Derridian type text, and the vortices and involvements of the Deleuzean text make it look less textual as a mode of presenting an account of what there is in the world. But in fact, it's a textual mode of presenting an account of what there is in the world. It can't not be.
The problem.
And it's a strong material sense of textuality, which permits you then not to set up some. Are they talking about words? Are they talking about worlds? There isn't such a split variable.
Because the problem is, what is the ontological status of textuality? What does that mean? On the one hand, Derrida says, okay, look, I'm not saying that the world is made of words. I'm not saying that texts, this is not linguistic idealism. But then, okay, how can it not be that? The problem is, obviously, that's an absurd position. But what does it mean to talk of space and time if these are not ontological terms? What are space and time if not ontological valences, ontological categories or concepts?
Well, presumably the functions are intertextuality, textuality, and intentionality understood non-realistically.
Okay, but then it seems I can't see how. Also this is Then the whole of science, the whole idea that there's an account of the world happening independently of any textual inscription, any metaphysical inscription whatsoever. The idea that there was a history before, there was space and time before metaphysics, and there will be after it, becomes absurd and inconceivable. And that's the problem. The very fact that becomes inconceivable points to the problem with this kind of this modus operandi.
Thank you very much.
I would like to approach a methodical problem. Your comparison of Heidegger and Deleuze under the heading time seems to suggest that both of them have a time concept which you can, translate one into the other in one or another way. And I'm wondering if that is possible, because I think that Deleuze, and as far as I understand that, and especially Kant and Bergson, have a time concept which is at work in epistemological reflection, while Heidegger has a time concept which is at work in a hermeneutical reflection, as in Simon's Being and Time. He starts this reflection on being and time with a reflection on questioning, which is a basically hermeneutical approach. So I'm wondering if you do not cover up these differences by bringing that together in the way you did it in that paper.
I think you're right. I think that's the basic, and this is what I really want to do is actually, Heidegger does, for Heidegger, meaning, understanding is an absolutely kind of crucial point. Being is something we understand, and time is something that allows us to understand how things are. That's the structure. That's something. It's very different in Deleuze, but nevertheless, Deleuze. Part of what I want to identify as part of the problem with Deleuze is this whole logic of expression. Deleuze talks about being is said, univocity, the thesis of univocity, being is said. He is talking about a kind of meaning, albeit not a hermeneutic meaning, or hermeneutic meaning. So the question, but Deleuze is actually, and he tries to elaborate this theory of sense, what sense is, in the logic of sense, which is even more kind of, baffling and kind of difficult than difference in repetition. And it seems to me that I think that, so I think you're absolutely right, that there is, and in fact understanding the divergence between them, but also where they kind of, where their projects run into difficulties, would necessitate pinpointing the nature of this, of their different, of what they mean by meaning. Basically, they have two very different theories of meaning, and I think Deleuze it's developed in the Spinoza book, but I think Deleuze is peculiar, but ultimately I think it's what turns him into a kind of idealist as well. Because the idea is that as soon as being is something that you have to mean, even if it's expressed, then I think it becomes impossible to carry out the kind of hugely ambitious ontological project that Deleuze is trying to carry out. But that's a very good point.
Might there be a difference between the concepts of metaphysics and of ontology? And if you approach that, you might have less problems.
Yes, well, Deleuze identifies a different tradition for himself, and it's key. It's very striking that the real adversary, I mean, he's sympathetic to Plato, but the real adversary for Deleuze, in Difference in Repetition, is Aristotle. If there's a philosopher of representation, it's Aristotle. And the logic of Aristotelian, categorization and categorical specification is precisely the kind of the way of thinking, the way of the kind of metaphysical thinking that Deleuze thinks is absolutely has run its course, or has merely kind of has become impossible to carry on. But he doesn't think we need to kind of. Deleuze thinks you can simply invent new conceptual resources. In other words, the difference between, Deleuze and Heidegger is that representation for Deleuze is not something within which we're inscribed, and it's not something we have to painfully and patiently negotiate our way out of through this long kind of this renegotiation, this deconstruction or destruction of the metaphysical tradition. You don't have to take a step back to take a step forward for Deleuze. Deleuze thinks, and this is part of what makes him so exhilarating, is that you can simply, there are these problems. Representation is a pernicious way of thinking, but we can easily circumvent it. It's just a bad habit for Deleuze. Representation is just a bad habit. For Heidegger and Derrida, metaphysics is not just a bad habit. It's a fatum. There's something. We can't simply jump out of it or start thinking, independently of this sedimented, these sedimented layers of accumulated of meaning, of accumulated meaning, precisely. So yeah, there is a real kind of difference in what they understand by metaphysics.
Perhaps I could ask a simple question, which is that when you say something like that what Deleuze describes for us is the purely actual rather than the possible experience, what kind of cognition is that for us when we're aware of it? What kind of awareness do we have it?
Purely actual? You mean when he's talking about...
Well, it was your phrase.
Okay.
I'm quoting you that. You said that he describes the purely actual rather than just the possible experience.
He thinks, well, famously, he takes over the critique of the distinction between the actual and the possible from Bergson. The idea that, in other words, he's not saying that everything that is actual in the present. That's precisely the whole point about virtuality, is that it's not present, it's not actual. What he's saying is that in order to understand the conditions that generate the specific characteristics of our actual experience, we can't simply kind of abstract, we can't simply kind of try to abstract back from the structures of experience to identify the possible structures that are only kind of, that either necessarily or contingently effectuated in experience. In other words, Bergson says the possible is merely a retroactive hypothesization of what is actual. In other words, you take, you've got the world, you've got actuality, and then you take something out of it, abstract it, take it out, and say that it was somehow before the actual, and it was actually, and it somehow conditioned actuality. Deleuze's attempt to kind of to identify the conditions for the genesis of actuality in the virtual he wants to avoid that mode of abstract reflection, working back from the given to understanding the kind of a set of possibilities which somehow preconfigure what we know to be given, what we experience as given. And his point is that we always experience more than we know we experience. In other words, the point about actual experience, the point is that the porous between the virtual and, the border between the virtual and the actual is porous, so that there's more going on in actual experience that we can ever be consciously aware of.
Sure, that sounds like a Leibnizian point. I mean,
Yeah.
The point that there are these numerous middle perceptions at any given moment, and the ability to be able to name, an experience is always, as it were, a selective process to filter something out.
Sure. Yeah.
That's a straight Leibnizian kind of argument. So, but I was wondering, what is it that he can direct us to this purely actual in some sense? What is it in it that he's directing us to? Is it, for me, that's what Kantian overtones. In Kant says, well, the actual is awareness of things like sensation.
Yes.
Right? Sensation is what's always given. Right? It's the constant. I mean, you can actually say something about what the actual is. I'm not getting from you a sense of what this actual is like.
Well, he thinks, his theory, at its most elementary level, the actual, what is actual is, when he's talking about these perception is precisely that which is effectuated by the passive synthesis of habit, by these contractions. That is, in other words, there are these pre-individual perceptions which populate the world, and they're not necessarily organically bounded. So the perception, and this is astonishing, and it's like, Leibniz is very important difference in repetition, that there are perceptions, just as there is thinking going on independently of us, and of what we think and experience. In other words, the experience that Deleuze, the actual experience that Deleuze is talking about, is precisely not just isomorphic or coextensive with what we call experience, with what we think of as experience. It's going on everywhere all the time.